Everybody thinks they know Rome, the gladiators, the glory, the revenge fantasies. Strip all of that away, and what you're left with in 166 AD is something no movie would dare show you honestly. Rome was rotting from the inside out. The Antonine Plague had swept through the empire like a slow fire, claiming millions and gutting the imperial treasury. Then came the worst possible news from the north. Along the frozen Danube River, nearly 200,000 warriors and their families poured through the gap. This was not a raid, this was a migration. These people weren't coming to steal Roman gold. They were coming to become the next Rome. Marcus Aurelius understood something that no amount of philosophy could soften. Rome did not need wisdom. Rome needed a monster it could aim. And that monster had a name. Marcus Nonius Macrinus. Forget the noble warrior you're imagining. Macrinus was one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Rome, refined, educated, and absolutely merciless. But the actual person was something far colder. He had zero interest in battlefield glory. He was obsessed with results. Grain shipments calculated to the last wagon, water sources secured or poisoned, supply chains mapped and severed. His methods were so brutal and precise that even the generals who fought alongside him kept their distance. When the northern frontier collapsed, Roman Emperor Aurelius didn't send Macrinus to rally the troops. He sent him to turn those troops into something their enemies had never faced before, built for one purpose: annihilation. It started with a cough. From the docks of Alexandria to the alleyways of Gaul, people started dropping. Whole families were dead before the week come to an end. By the late 160s AD, a devastating disease outbreak was carving through the Roman Empire like a blade through parchment. Behind closed doors, the emperor's advisors counted the damage, and even the toughest men went pale. Fewer people were paying taxes. Fewer bodies were available to fill the legions. Garrisons were stuffed with untrained teenagers and old men. Money meant for walls and roads was instead spent trying to stop the starving from rioting. On the far side of the Danube, someone was watching this collapse unfold and counting. His name was Balamar, king of the Marcomanni. Roman historians dismissed him as just another savage warlord, but what he did next tells a different story. For generations, his people had lived under Roman pressure, forced tributes, borders redrawn at Roman convenience. They had watched legions march into their forests, deliver punishment, then retreat behind the Danube as if it were a divine wall that could never be crossed. Now Balamar sent runners to every neighboring tribe. His message was radical: cross the river, seize Roman land, make it permanently theirs. Not theft, replacement. What formed was not an army, it was a nation on the move. Warriors at the front, behind them wives, children, elders, livestock, everything a people needs to start over. Roman scouts watching from distant ridgelines reported something that turned their stomachs. The line fell apart. Walls that had held for centuries crumbled in mere days. By AD 166 to 167, enemy forces were driving straight toward the Roman heartland. Emperor Aurelius needed someone who looked at soldiers and saw arithmetic. That is how Marcus Nonius Macrinus stepped onto the stage. Macrinus was born into serious wealth near Brescia, private tutors, Greek poetry at dinner. He climbed the political ladder all the way to the consulship. On paper, he looked like the pampered aristocrat who would crumble under real pressure, but those who worked with him knew better. When Marcus Aurelius met with him privately, he spoke plainly. The tribal coalition outnumbered Rome's remaining armies. Hit hard by the plague provinces, could barely feed themselves. If the enemy swept through Rome, the psychological damage would be impossible to repair. Macrinus didn't respond with comfort. He gave orders. Complete control over the northern theater. Authority to remove any officer, no matter the rank, total command of supply routes, the right to override provincial governors. Marcus Aurelius agreed to every demand because the only alternative was watching the empire collapse. When Macrinus arrived at the northern front, there was no army waiting to greet him, only a disaster pretending to be one. Sick soldiers lay in makeshift shelters. Weapons rotted in neglected piles. Latrines had overflowed weeks ago, contaminating the water. Horses were gaunt. Men stared at the ground with hollow eyes. These were no longer warriors. They were men waiting to die. Step into the officers' quarters, and it was a different world entirely. Heated tents, imported wine, personal servants. Men who had bought their positions through connections, crafting reports back to Rome, designed not to show the truth, but to protect their career. Macrinus moved silently through the camp. He asked quiet, precise questions. The numbers didn't add up. He saw immediately that the army's greatest enemy wasn't the plague. It wasn't the tribal horde. It was the rot at its very core. He called a full assembly. Every officer, every soldier, sick or healthy, noble or common. Then, he began calling names. One by one, commanders stepped forward. The accusations were surgical. You abandoned this post on that date. You reported 4,000 ready troops when fewer than 2,000 could stand. You diverted grain meant for starving soldiers to private merchants. The consequences were brutal. Officers stripped of rank in front of their men. Some executed on the spot. For units that had fled, he revived decimation. The real thing, 1 man in 10, chosen at random, killed by his own comrades while the rest watched. Through it all, Macrinus was eerily calm. No anger, no cruelty for its own sake. He carried out punishment with the detached precision of a surgeon cutting away disease. And the moment the purge was done, he shifted focus. Soldiers who had shown courage, regardless of birth, were promoted. Experienced veterans were pulled from forgotten posts to places where they mattered. Aristocrats who had bought commissions were moved to the rear. From that day on, the only currency that mattered was proven ability. He demanded a full accounting of every resource. Grain, wagons, weapons. Supply lines were redrawn with ruthless precision, calculated by calories and marching days, not heroic gestures. Sick soldiers were quarantined, latrines rebuilt far from water. Within weeks, deaths began to fall, not by miracle, but because someone had decided to fight disease with the same discipline used to fight an enemy army. Training resumed under conditions that would have broken peacetime soldiers. Timed marches through snow and mud. Battle formations drilled until instinctive. Failure was punished. Excellence was rewarded. Macrinus also made sure his men never forgot the stakes. Refugees from destroyed villages were brought into camp. Farmers spoke of homes burning. Mothers told of children torn from their arms. Scouts led units to massacred settlements. Some men vomited, some froze in shock. Then Macrinus would speak, brief, quiet. This is what will reach your family if you fail. Within the chain of command, he cultivated something more powerful than loyalty. Fear. Fear of the enemy in the north, fear of the commander behind them. Trapped between those two forces, the army had no choice but to change, and it did. Balamar's host kept grinding south. Reports poured in, villages burning, Roman units scattered, civilians gripped by terror. Macrinus absorbed every detail and faced a hard truth. Even rebuilt, his army was still outnumbered. A head-on clash could win, maybe, but the cost would gut what was left of Rome's military strength. So he drew a plan that, at first glance, seemed insane. He summoned his senior commanders and placed his hand flat on the map, not tracing a path toward the enemy, but deeper into Roman territory. We are not defending this border. We are giving it up. The room went silent. One general finally spoke the thought everyone shared. This was betrayal. To surrender fortified towns, keep bridges, supply depots, without a fight? Macrinus met their eyes without hesitation. They were not seeing a retreat. They were looking at a trap the size of an empire. A migrating army needs food. It needs water every single day. They didn't need to destroy Rome in one glorious battle. They only needed to feel every step as though they were marching deeper into a coffin. Orders went out within hours. Evacuate every civilian, burn every grain store, drive livestock inland, tear down bridges the moment the last Roman foot crossed, leave nothing the enemy could use. Behind the retreating columns, specialized units worked the emptied land. Wells were fouled with lime, carcasses, and waste. Grain stores were soaked in brine or oil. Orchards were ring-barked to die standing. Any building sturdy enough to shelter a warband was dismantled or rigged to collapse. When Balamar's forces finally crossed the abandoned frontier, they expected a feast. Roman standards gone, gates wide open, storehouses overflowing, terrified civilians ready to surrender. Instead, they found a void, every well poisoned, every grain sack ruined, livestock nothing but bloated corpses. Buildings that looked intact from afar revealed scorched interiors and weakened beams. Mile after mile, the same truth repeated itself. Nothing usable, nothing alive, just emptiness wearing the mask of a conquered land. Behind the warriors, the migrating nation suffered first. Children screamed from thirst. Old men collapsed on frozen roads. Mothers scraped frozen earth around poisoned wells. Foraging parties went farther every day and returned with less. And still, there was no sign of the Roman army. The young warriors sang of Roman cowardice. The elders, hardened by past encounters with the legions, understood the danger in silence. The enemy had vanished. But starvation was already gnawing at their own people. Balamar pushed for speed. He wanted a decisive engagement that would end everything. Macrinus had no intention of giving him that victory. One intelligence report stopped Macrinus cold. A stone outpost at a marshy ford, Nalus Ford, held by roughly 10,000 tribal fighters, with a suspicious gap between them and Balamar's main body. It looked like a trap. Macrinus understood immediately. Balamar expected the Romans to assault the defenders, then swing the main force around to hit the Roman flank in the swamp. A textbook ambush, deadly against 9 out of 10 Roman generals. For the first time in weeks, a hint of a smile crossed Macrinus's face. He didn't march his entire army into the trap. Instead, he selected 3,000 of his finest troops and traced a route on the map that looked insane. 80 kilometers through frozen marshes, dense scrub, and abandoned farm tracks. No fires, minimal sleep. Anyone who fell behind would be left where they dropped. The target wasn't Nalus Ford. It was far behind the enemy's main baggage train. The target was terror. They moved at dusk, torches extinguished as soon as the sun set. Water numbed their legs, mud sucked at their boots. By midnight, they were deep in what should have been the enemy's secure rear. Ahead, barely visible in the moonlight, campfires flickered. Wagons, hide tents, families. This was not an army. This was the back end of a migrating nation. Then the night exploded. Roman war horns shattered the darkness from 3 directions. Flaming arrows tore into wagons. Tents erupted in walls of fire. Roman soldiers struck with mechanical precision, not to plunder but to destroy. Harnesses severed. Animals stampeded into the swamp. Axes split wagon wheels. Torches set everything combustible ablaze. Through it all, Macrinus's final instruction held, "Do not seal every escape route. Let them run." Every survivor carried something worse than a wound. They carried a memory, Roman specters materializing from swamp and shadow, destroying everything, then disappearing into nothing. Less than an hour after the first horn, Macrinus signaled, "Withdrawal." Within minutes, they vanished. The effect on the coalition was immediate. Smaller tribes whispered about Roman ghosts and ancient curses. Warriors who had been singing of Rome's death days earlier now sat awake all night, staring into the dark spaces between the trees. If the families in the rear weren't safe, safety itself had become a fiction. More importantly, the supplies lost were irreplaceable. Every wagon burned was another week stripped from the coalition's ability to survive. Macrinus now began assembling the final phase. He studied maps of the northern Italian plain, searching for one perfect combination: terrain that would funnel a massive army into a narrow front, natural barriers to hold his flanks, and a target so psychologically vital that a starving enemy would throw itself forward without hesitation. His finger settled on Aquileia. The fortified city controlled the northeastern approaches into the heart of Italy. If it fell, the shockwave would reach Rome itself. If it held under the right conditions, the surrounding region could become a slaughterhouse. Macrinus arrived weeks before the first tribal scout would even glimpse the walls. He walked the entire perimeter on foot, counting paces between towers, testing the soil with his hands, questioning magistrates about drainage channels and abandoned quarries. To him, Aquileia was not a community to protect, it was a weapon to be armed. Then he pushed units outside the walls. Roman soldiers tore into the earth, deep zigzag trenches, sharpened stakes, defensive ramparts, artillery platforms on every rise. Hills sealed one flank, the river the other. The only path for a large attacking force narrowed steadily, a corridor designed to break a charge, fragment formations, and bleed an army dry. When Balamar's coalition finally appeared on the horizon, something surged through the starving ranks like electricity. A real Roman city, intact walls, smoke curling from chimneys, rooftops glinting in pale winter light. Behind those walls had to be granaries, livestock, fresh water. One overwhelming assault, and everything would change. What the scouts failed to grasp was what the ground itself had become. The morning of the main assault broke cold and colorless. No speeches. Macrinus had said everything the night before. Hold your position. Follow the rotation. Remember what reaches your families if this line fails. When the charge came, the ground seemed to shake. The front ranks hit the first line of obstacles immediately. Men plunged into hidden ditches, drove themselves onto sharpened stakes. Roman artillery roared. Iron bolts slammed through shields, and the men behind them with unflinching precision. Where the coalition reached the Roman line, legionaries stood shoulder to shoulder, short swords thrusting through gaps in the shield wall. No heroics, no flourishes, just efficient, practiced killing. Behind the front, fresh cohorts waited in rotation. The moment fatigue weakened a section, exhausted soldiers fell back through prearranged gaps while rested troops stepped forward. The Roman defense never faltered. The coalition had no such system. Hours dragged on, measured in inches. By mid-afternoon, the fracture became clear. Assaults lost their momentum. Warriors pushed forward like they were wading through water. Rear ranks hesitated. Some stopped entirely. Balamar threw everything he had at the line, his personal guard, his last reserves. He rallied them with brutal honesty. Break through now, or cease to exist as a people. Macrinus received the report he had waited for all morning. The enemy's final reserves were fully committed. Nothing remained behind them. He turned to the cavalry commander hidden in the hills. Now, thousands of hooves thundered down the slopes, smashing through the thin flank guards. At the same time, hidden infantry emerged near the rear river crossings, cutting off every escape. The sprawling mass of humanity suddenly found itself enclosed in a tightening ring of Roman steel. The trap snapped shut. Artillery crews adjusted their aim inward. Every bolt that landed inside that shrinking circle struck human flesh. What had begun as a battle was now systematic annihilation. Somewhere in that field, Balamar died. Later accounts differ, but the likeliest truth is less dramatic than legend. He died in the mud beneath a featureless gray sky, consumed by the very ground he had led his people onto. When the last echoes of resistance died out, the ground around Aquileia looked like something the human mind was not built to process. Trenches buried under layers of corpses, open fields turned into a continuous carpet of bodies, broken weapons, shattered equipment stretching as far as the eye could see. Macrinus rode slowly across the field. This was the result of months of scorched earth, poisoned water, night raids, psychological warfare, and brutal internal discipline. An invading force that had begun as a migrating nation, nearly 200,000 strong and confident of victory, lay shattered in a tightening ring of death outside a city they never breached. Weeks later, Marcus Aurelius arrived to oversee the aftermath. He took hostages, imposed troop levies, dictated terms. In his private journals, he wrote of war in the abstract language of philosophy, accepting fate, performing duty without attachment. He did not describe the trenches outside Aquileia. He did not acknowledge that the survival of Roman Italy had depended on a man who wielded starvation and calculated terror like precision instruments. In the years that followed, unofficial monuments praised the emperor's wisdom. Macrinus appeared in official records, his consulship, his years of service, but the specifics of his actions were softened, abbreviated, or omitted. Rome wanted victories. It did not want to examine the tools too closely. Gradually, Macrinus faded from prominence. When the Western Empire finally crumbled, his memory almost entirely vanished. Then, in the modern era, archaeologists uncovered a monumental tomb outside Rome. The name etched into stone sent ripples through the academic world: Marcus Nonius Macrinus. Journalists quickly dubbed him the real gladiator. His career, his era, his proximity to Marcus Aurelius drew a loose parallel to the fictional general from the films. The public embraced it. They wanted to see him through that cinematic lens. The loyal warrior, the moral compass, the hero fighting for something pure. The reality fits none of that. The real Macrinus won by turning an entire region into an uninhabitable wasteland, by starving enemy families, by engineering a battlefield where tens of thousands were compressed into a shrinking ring and systematically destroyed outside the walls of Aquileia. He approached war as a mathematical problem and solved it with cold variables. How many days of grain before collapse? How many kilometers before exhaustion? How many dead before the will to fight simply broke? So why does almost no one talk about him? Because his story makes us uncomfortable. We prefer wars with clean moral boundaries. We prefer leaders who suffer beautifully, wielding swords in fair, witnessed combat. Marcus Aurelius gets the statues, the book covers. The Gladiator films give audiences a hero who fights for family and righteous vengeance. Macrinus, the man who arguably did more than either to keep Italy from collapsing, gets a handful of inscriptions and the faint echo of his name. But if you trace the reality, the logistics, the strategy, the geography of where bodies fell in snow and mud, you find him there, standing in the shadows. You find the butcher Rome unleashed when philosophy and mercy alone could not hold the world together. And maybe that is exactly why, when we tell these stories on screen, we change his face and soften his edges. We want to believe the world can be saved by men who fight honorably in open arenas under the sun. The harder truth? More often, the world is saved, at least for a time, by people willing to give orders that will never be carved into marble.